So, hello everyone. It's wonderful to see you all here today on this beautiful day. I think summer is starting, hopefully, fingers crossed. But we're not here today to talk about the weather. We're here today to talk about a question that's very fundamental to us as human beings. Who am I? It's a foundational question we all have about ourselves, a question we may have asked at least once in our life, perhaps many times. And it's a timeless question that humanity has always asked itself, and we're going to attempt to answer it because it's not a simple question. It's quite a complex question. When I mean the word complex means something that's woven together, or weaved together. And the human being is, as we're going to see, has many aspects, has many different parts, biological. We are rational, psychological, spiritual, intuition. There's many different dimensions that are part of who we are, that are interwoven together, interconnected, interdependent. So we're going to try to understand this question, or try to find some answers to this question by looking at genes, biology, and we're going to look at neuroscience. So two different perspectives. And but before I start talking about genetics or what genes are, I want to look at the vision that science gives us today. But science gives us a certain vision, a certain view of life that we've inherited, if we realize it or not. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about that, because that gives a little bit of context to what I'm going to talk about in terms of genetics and neuroscience. So what is this vision that we have today? This way of thinking, this way of looking at the world, this way of looking at ourselves. And it's called reductive materialism. Now what does that mean? Sounds very complicated. Reductive means to reduce things. So science reduces things to its smallest components in order for scientists trying to understand something that's very complicated. That's a good strategy. So if you have something complicated, you break it down into small elements. You try to understand the small elements. And those smallest elements tend to be of a material nature, because scientists have to measure them, we have to weigh them, we have to compare them. So it's reducing things, and then from when we reduce them, we try to build a model and trying to create a mathematical model in general to try to understand what's happening. So we create a model of reality. And then we go and test the model. If the model says this is going to do that, and that does that, and to match, if there's correspondence between the two of them, then we know the model is correct, our theory is correct. So we have to test it, we have to observe it, we have to verify it. It's a good strategy. So this strategy, this scientific approach, has worked very well for us over the last few centuries. And it's worked so well, we've had great tools, fantastic tools. So we have great medicine, technology, communications, smartphones. So we have fantastic technology. But we have gained put so much confidence in this scientific method that we have placed a lot of faith in it. And that reminds me of a conversation I had when I was a young philosopher with an acquaintance of mine. We were having a cup of coffee, and I was saying to him about science, that the history of science, that ideas have changed over time. Scientists thought hundreds of years ago, such and such was like this, but they realized that after a period of time, well, that was maybe wrong, or maybe it wasn't totally correct. It was an approximation, and they changed their views. But my acquaintance was he was taken aback by this, because he thought science was the absolute truth. When something is said scientifically true, it's true. So he said something to me. He said, "For me, science is God." And I went, I never thought of that way. Science is God. Seems a bit paradoxical. But today, when we see something on TV, or we read something on the newspapers that something is scientifically proven, what do we generally do? Do we just say, no, it can't be true? Or do we say, okay, it's true? Generally, we say, if it's scientifically proven, that's it. We just switch off. Scientist says it's true, it's true. So we placed a lot of faith in science. Science has become a new, I don't want to use the word religion, but it's become a new authority that's very high, that's up there, that we don't question anymore. And we can see today on the internet and in newspapers and so on, that sometimes we hear things and we kind of go, that doesn't sound right. Because it's been kind of the scientific slogan has been abused somewhat. So I want to just kind of frame it that way, because sometimes we think anything that's scientifically proven is true, but it's not. There's always a process of questioning. There's always a way of trying to make the model better. It's always a path of trying to get closer and closer to the truth. But accepting that someday we're never going to reach it. It's always a journey. And that's why I described or named or titled this first talk, the Gene Delusion. Because the way genes are used today in the media, sometimes we think that if we have a gene for something, that's it. It's genetic determinism, it's called. That if I have a gene, that's it, I can't change, there's no choice. But that's not the case. It was taught that way at one stage, but things have changed over time. Genes or genetics understanding of it has changed and adapted with time. So what is a gene? What is genetics? Well, I'm going to try to explain it in 3 or 4 minutes. So it's going to be an approximation. But I'm going to pick a moment in time. I'm going to pick 1953. And there was great excitement in the scientific community because they had they discovered the structure of DNA, the double helix. And I imagine most of you are familiar with it. This double helix. I'll draw it here. Oh, I'll try to draw it. Oh, God. Okay, so we use your imagination, okay? I mean, I think you've seen it, most of you. So it's this idea of a double helix, and you have these rungs or these ladders that are connected double helix together, okay? So it's a double helix, and it's these molecules that connect the helix together, okay? So that's fantastic. What's so special about that? Because these different molecules here, they're arranged in such a way that they contain information. They contain a code. And it's one code we're very familiar with, the binary code, 111 zeros, all these ones and zeros. In that, there's information. But in DNA, it's a different type of code. It's ATCG, I think. Okay? So the gene is a code, it's information. And it's in this structure. And every cell in the body has this DNA structure, which is very, very long, that's wrapped up. Okay, you don't need to know all the technical details. What's important is the gene is information, and that information is used by the body, by our cells, to construct, to build proteins, and proteins help to build us. Okay, so when that code was discovered, it was big news in the world, and biologists were very, very excited because scientists thought that they had discovered the code of life. They thought that their vision of a human being was very reductionist, very material. Imagine it's a model, so they saw us more as biological robots, and that if we understood the code, the genes, that we could fix all our diseases, we could fix all our problems, because if it's like a bug in software, you just go into the gene, fix the code, and everything will be okay. So just one thing I forgot to mention, a gene is a section of this DNA that has some information. So that's a gene. Then another strand, you could have a gene here. That's another gene. So along that long strand of DNA, you have many sections that have code. And those individual units are called genes, okay? So that was very exciting. So then there was a project to read the entire code for the human being and for other plants and animals, these DNA strands. So we could read the code, understand the code. So we're going to read the code of the human being. And some scientists thought the code is who we are. It's like a program. It's like a computer program. So with that vision in mind, they thought when they read the code of the DNA, it would be a big code because we're very complicated, as we know. And we thought that code would be very big. And they thought codes for plants and animals would be a much smaller code because they're less complicated. So for example, a banana and a human being, well, a human being should have a lot more code than a banana. But something very interesting happened. When they started reading the code for banana and a human being, what do you think happened? What did it discover? Pardon? Go on ahead.
The number of genes might be similar.
Well, yeah, they're a little bit similar. Human being has about approximately 20,000 protein genes, and a banana has 32,000 protein genes. So a banana, genetically speaking, is much more complicated. So, okay, I don't know, what does that say? So, I don't know. So what it says is that perhaps their vision was not quite right. Maybe perhaps it's not a code. Perhaps it means something else. So, but this idea of a code started to propagate. And James Watson, one of the discoverers of this DNA structure, he said, "We used to think that our fate was in our stars. Now we know, in large measure, our fate is in our genes." So he was a very influential scientist, and him and others were very excited about this idea, and they started proposing that who we are is in our genes, because the genes make the proteins make the organs, and so on and so forth. This is called genetic determinism. Who we are is in our genes. So if we have a gene for distraction, well, it's in our genes. We're distracted. If we have a gene for, I don't know, we like cake or something like that. I'm being a bit flippant. I'm being a bit silly here, but not so much so, because they started to say that genes are associated with certain behaviors, certain qualities, certain so on and so forth. So much so that sometimes we say to ourselves that it's in my genes. I can't change. It's in my genetics. My parents, you give me these genes, this is the way I am. What does that mean? I can't change. Well, the good news is it's not on our genes. Of course, genes have an impact, of course, but we're not our genes. So we have a choice. We can change. So I'm sorry to say that, but I'm also happy to say that, because now we don't have an excuse. We can change, okay? So that's one good news piece, okay? As time went on, in 1976, Richard Dawkins published a book called The Selfish Gene. Wasn't a great title. It a lot of misunderstandings of what he was talking about. But he continued this metaphor of the code, but he says that we're not our genes, that we're also influenced by culture, by morality, by our mind, by external things. We're not this idea of genetic determinism was kind of starting to break. And as the field progressed, there was more discoveries called epigenetics. The word epi means above, and above genetics. So our behaviors we have a choice in what we do. There are genes passed on, but there are also our behaviors passed on. There's values passed on, there's concepts passed on. So in our families, the genes are passed on, but at the same time, in our families, there's certain outlooks in life passed on, certain behaviors passed on. Some of those may be wholesome and positive, and some of them may not be. So things become a lot more complicated. Richard Dawkins calls these non-physical entities memes. That memes are passed on as well, not only your genes, because he wanted the two words to sound similar so we remember it. So at the moment, there's more of a view that genes are like DNA, or like a database, that the cell goes into the nucleus and takes out a gene, which is like a model to help build things. So it's like if we want to build this building from scratch, There's a gene for plasterboard. There's a gene for a brick. There's a gene for the boards and nails. So all these models, the cell can go in, get them, build something, something like a wall or a brick or something, and start building from scratch. So it's a more system view of life, that everything is interconnected, interdependent. It's just not the bottom layer, it's just not genes, but it's the cell, it's the organ, it's the organism, it's the body. It's many different things interconnected. And that's why I said at the beginning, it's complex, because there are many things interdependent and interdependent, interconnected. Dennis Noble, if you want, he's one of the people who describes that a lot. He describes it very eloquently. So far we've seen that we have genes. We're not determined by them. We're impacted by them, yes. But we have a choice. We're conscious beings. We have a choice in what we do. We have agency. And where does that agency come from? And here I'm going to talk a little bit about neuroscience. And neuroscience is the study of the structure and function of our nervous systems, the brain, the spinal cord, and so on. And it's a huge field. It's a field that's been going on or existing for a long time. There's many different views in it. It's just not one view. There's many different views about what the brain is, what the mind is, what consciousness is. So it's a very rich in its different views, which for me is very interesting, because the mind, or the brain is it's very mysterious. We still don't know a lot about the brain. We know certain things for sure, and it's fantastic. We can help correct things in medicine, but it's very mysterious. The earliest people who kind of studied the brain that we know of were the ancient Egyptians, and they noticed when there was brain injury that people reacted differently. So they were able to connect the brain and certain behaviors. But where we start to see neuroscience starting to develop and starting off was more around the scientific revolution. And people started to study anatomy, started experimenting. And René Descartes proposed some early theories. He's famous for I think, therefore I am. So in the 1800s, scientists started to study the brain a little bit more rigorously. But it's only in the 20th century that, with this kind of reductionist material model, that scientists started to look at the brain, trying to understand it. And what they initially thought it was like lots of wires connected together in our head, because they weren't able to look inside and see what was happening when it was alive. So they thought it was just lots of wires. But with time, they said it was more like an adaptive neural network. But one important thing was, they started to explain, was that the brain structure, we can change the brain structure. That once we have a certain brain structure, that's not it. It's not fixed. No, it adapts, it changes. Neural networks change and adapt according to your experiences or learnings. It's called neuroplasticity. And it's the same idea with the genes. We can change. We just don't. Sometimes we hear people saying, that's the way I'm wired. I'm an engineering background, so that's my friend says that to me. It's like, that's just the way I'm wired. And I said, no, it's not the way you're wired. That's your current wiring, but you don't have to stick with that wiring. The wiring is not good. What do? You change the wiring. I have an electrician friend of mine who says, if the wiring is not working for the lights, you go and you change the wiring. Okay? But in the 1970s onwards, the brain was a little bit of like a black box. You couldn't see what was inside when it was working. And with new technologies, they started to see that, okay, so when we think, certain parts of the brain light up, certain things happen. Fantastic discoveries. And they started to ask the question, well, is that part of the brain the source of that thinking? Is who I am there in that part of the brain? So there's lots of debates about what part of the brain is who we are, is our identity. Some thought it was more the front, some thought it was more the back, some thought it was... So there's lots and lots of questions. And some scientists started to say, well, is there a source of identity in the brain only? Is there a source of consciousness just in the brain? Some AI scientists say that in a few years, in a decade or two, AI will become conscious, because they modeled AI using the structure or the networks of the brain. And if the brain is just lots of neural connections and it's conscious, well, then with time, if there's more neural connections in a machine, more complexity, then a machine will become conscious. I don't agree with this myself. So, but if you use that reasoning, the sun is a huge electrical network as well, different type of network. And if there's enough connections and enough neural activity, can the sun be conscious as well? It's an interesting question. Rupert Sheldrake talks about this, the scientist Rupert Sheldrake. He says, perhaps the sun is conscious. Obviously, it's a different type of consciousness. It's not the same consciousness as ours. But it's this idea of panpsychism, that everything in nature is conscious. It's a fundamental aspect of nature. You have matter or energy and you have consciousness, and both of them are interconnected. Anyway, I just want to, just a side note there, but it's very interesting. But by the 1990s, there was more interdiscipline work in trying to understand the brain. And they try to understand, is the brain all we are, or is the brain connected to the whole body, to the whole organism? And does that impact the way we think, the way we do things? And a neuroscientist called Antonio Damasio wrote a famous book called Descartes' Error. And in it he says that we're just not a calculator with legs. We're just not a brain with legs, no. That the brain grew up or developed or evolved with the body, and that we have an affective phenomena according with the brain as well. We have emotions that are part of our brain. So we're just not a calculator or a big software. We also have emotions as well that work together with the brain. So it's in a way in philosophy you'd say it's to think, to feel, and to act. And in the Descartes' Error explains that you may think very well, but if your feelings or your emotions are not there, you can get stuck in circular thoughts. You can get stuck in black and white thinking. We need our feelings as well to understand what's the right thing to do. Because in our feelings, there's knowledge as well. Generosity, compassion, solidarity. There is knowledge, information, insights in our emotional world, our sentiments. So these need to work together, because you could have great ideas, great clarity in your brain, but if you don't put your heart behind it, what happens? And nothing happens. At the same time, you could feel very strongly about something, but you don't know why, and then we don't do anything. So it's to integrate all those aspects. It's like I said with Dennis Noble, it's a system. You have to interconnect many different selves as one. And it's the idea of yoga in the East, to think, to feel, and act as one. A doctor in America, he said something, I just found this the other day, he said something very interesting. He's a heart surgeon, and he says the heart and the mind are part of one integral system. And that changes how we think about prevention, treatment, really everything. And he said, if someone has a heart attack, it affects their brain. If someone has a problem with their brain, it affects their heart. And this was a very ancient idea, that the heart, there's consciousness in the heart. And the neuroscience had discovered that there's neurons in the heart as well. There's also neurons in our stomach. And it makes sense, because we have a spinal cord, we have neural connections everywhere. So suggests that there's consciousness everywhere in the body. So I haven't really talked about the elephant in the room. So what is the mind? Because I talked a lot about the brain. And some scientists, as I said, think that the mind is an illusion. It's something that the brain creates. Maybe another word for the mind is our consciousness. There's some neuroscientists think that we don't really have free will. Our decisions are not really made by us. It's just an illusion. There's other neuroscientists that think that the brain is like a receiver. The brain's like a filter. It's a bridge to the mind, which is fundamentally part of who we are. And an analogy to use to help explain this, to help us understand it a little bit, is like if we try to draw something, a TV. So we have a TV with a receiver. So when I was growing up, we had TVs and they had these big antennas on it. And if you want a good signal, you had to, move this antenna around. You had to open the curtain, maybe have to do it. I know it's not now, but when I was growing up. So it's a little bit like that. The TV is like the brain. It's the hardware. But the signal, the intelligence, the sound, the agency comes from somewhere else. If we didn't know anything about receivers, about TVs, if there was music and sound and movement here, where would we think that comes from? We think it comes from the hardware. We think it comes from here. But if we didn't understand about receivers, well, we just think that's all it is. It's hardware. So what these neuroscientists are saying is we have a receiver inside ourselves, and that receiver receives our mind, consciousness. I'm trying to use different words here to help us understand something, because the mind's not physical. They say it's much more subtler, but it's part of our identity. It's part of who we are. So neuroscientists like Wilfred Penfield and Ian McGilchrist and others talk about this analogy that we have receivers and the brain receives the mind. What happens when the TV is switched off? Is the mind gone? It's a good question. What happens? Neurosurgeons are trying to answer that. And for me, this neurosurgeons have described procedures where they have to operate on someone's brain, but they have to really shut down the brain. They have to make it lower the temperature. And they describe one procedure where they operated on a lady's brain. She had earmuffs on. She was clinically dead for a few minutes for the procedure to happen. And afterwards, when she regained consciousness, they asked her, how are you? How did the thing go? And she started complaining about the operation because someone was playing music during the procedure. They said something that she felt was very offensive, and they were there looking at her going, how is that possible? That's not possible. So what does that suggest?
It means that you're not fully switched off.
You're not fully switched. So the mind is still there. Because they say the mind is more subtler. It's anyway. So
the same thing can happen when you go to sleep. If you're not fully asleep, you can still know what's going on around you, even with your eyes closed.
Yes, but in this case, the brain was totally switched off. It's like switching off the TV, and there was still a consciousness, still an awareness. This is very well documented in near-death experiences. Why I'm saying this is because I'm trying to bring other perspectives into the question of who am I. Because sometimes our society, or not sometimes, our society tends to focus more on the material aspect. That's what scientific world vision we were brought up in. And of course we have a physical aspect, we cannot deny that. But we have many other selves inside of us as well. So how does the mind manifest? How is the mind channeled through the brain or filtered through the brain? And neuroscientist Ian McGilchrist explains that the power of the brain is due to the number of connections in the brain. The more connections you have in the brain, the more powerful it is. Okay, so that's how they explain the brain, how we have so much power in the brain. Similar idea to AI. So if you have a brain, the more connections there are, the greater the power of the brain, okay? But we have to ask ourselves the question, why is the brain split in two? Why is there a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere? Because that actually reduces the power of the brain, because it reduces the number of connections. So there's less connections. So there's less left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. And neuroscientists, or human-glucostic neuroscientists, explains that the mind has two facets. It's double. We have a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. And they ask the question, why is that? One explanation, potential explanation, is that in evolution, when an animal wants to search for food, it has to be very focused on the food. So if there's something running around, it has to be dead focused, very clear, very fast, and to be able to grab it. Okay, that makes sense, but you're hunting. But at the same time, if you're so focused on your food, what happens if you're so focused on your food? You're not focused on what's happening around you. So there's another way, another aspect of the mind that focus on what's happening around it. So there's two ways of attending to the world, two attentions in the world. One is a very focused, narrow type of attention, and the other is a more wide sort of attention. And we need to use both of them at the same time. So the left hemisphere is more narrow focused, it's more black and white, it's more analytical, it's much quicker, it doesn't think as deep, but it has to think fast. And right hemisphere has to see the whole picture, has to see what's happening all around it. It tends to focus much deeper. Its thinking is much deeper. It takes a little bit longer, but it goes more in depth. And it sees the totality. The left is more analytical, breaks things up, and the right is able to bring things together, see the totality. So there are two forms of attention, two aspects of the mind. And Ian McGilchrist explains that the left hemisphere, we today in our world tend to be more left hemisphere dominated. We tend to be very focused on certain things, very black and white thinking, very analytical. But we tend not to see the big picture. We tend not to put things together. And he explains in his book, The Master and the Emissary, we need both. There's need to be able to see. So it's like reading the page. You have to be able to see the different words. But at the same time, you have to be able to put the words together to see the picture. If we only see the words, well, we're not going to really understand the context. We're not going to understand why. The right hemisphere asks the question, why? Deep questions. Why am I here? Who am I? Left hemisphere says, how? Two different ways of attending. One's not better than the other, but we need both. And today in our society, as Gilchrist explains, that we have gone more to the left, more to science, which is fantastic, great technology, but at the sacrifice of trying to understand the why, trying to understand the values, the vision. So we need to bring both of them together. But how do we do that? How do we bring both hemispheres together? Well, if I use my analogy of the TV signal, if we don't tune in very well to the mind, to the channel, it's a bit hazy, it's a bit noisy. I remember when we were growing up, if the TV signal wasn't very good, it was very noisy on the signal. Today, it's phone reception. In a very not a good area, you can't hear the person. So if we don't have good reception inside ourselves, there's a lot of noise inside ourselves. There's not good receptivity. So it's trying to reduce the noise inside oneself so we can hear our different selves. Neuroscientists call that, they describe it as metacognition. Meta means above, cognition is to think, so it's to observe ourselves thinking. Because we tend to, with the left hemisphere, we tend to go into kind of a very automatic, habitual way of thinking. We just think, but we don't ask ourselves, why am I thinking that way? Why am I feeling that way? We just mechanistically go with our neural pathways. Metacognition is to take a certain perspective inside ourselves and go, oh, stop, hold on a second. It's like the right hemisphere. Why am I thinking that way? Is that the right thing to think about? Perhaps I should do things differently. Socrates, the Greek philosopher Socrates, would say to enter into dialogue with ourselves, to ask ourselves the question, why? And it might sound a little bit silly to dialogue with yourself, But you have to ask yourself the question, why am I going down that route? Why am I so hypersensitive? Why do I get angry? Why am I so dependent on another person's comments to make me feel good? These are all deep philosophical questions to understand ourselves. Who am I? Am I my fears? Am I my doubts? No, you're not your fears. You're not your doubts. We're afraid of something. Okay, but I'm not my fear. So metacognition. Different schools of philosophy, ancient schools of philosophy, have called it different things. In Buddhism, they're fantastic for this because they're trying to understand the nature of the mind a lot. Because the mind can be a fantastic tool, a fantastic aspect of our identity, but if we let it go wild like a bull through a field, it can create a lot of damage. And to use this in the metaphor of the bull going through the field, create havoc. It's like when we were growing up, we were taught a lot by our parents to control our body, to stand up straight, to walk straight, to be able to use our arms very well, to play sports. But when we were growing up, we haven't been taught how to use the mind. We haven't been taught to be able to concentrate, to focus, to not to allow ourselves to get distracted, not to go into circular thoughts, not to go into black and white thinking. There's a structure to the mind, and we're trying to understand it so we master ourselves better, to know ourselves better. Socrates would say, "The only thing I know is that I don't know." And what he means by this is that to know ourselves, to discover ourselves, to awaken the best inside ourselves, well, we have to accept that we don't know ourselves that well. Okay, we know aspects of ourselves, of course, like we have a more superficial understanding of ourselves. But to truly know who I am, that takes work. It's a journey. It just doesn't happen overnight or a workshop. It's a lifetime because there's a lot of beauty inside ourselves, but we need to discover it. We need to awaken it. So, as Marcus Aurelius would have said every day, what have I done today to become a better person? When we start asking ourselves those questions, we'll start to know ourselves. We'll start to know our body, our genes. We'll start to know our emotions, affective phenomena. We'll start to know the brain, how the brain operates a little bit. We'll start understanding the left hemisphere. In the Eastern traditions, it's called kama manas, very black and white way of thinking. We'll know the right hemisphere. It's called manas, pure mind, to be able to think well. And perhaps there's something above that as well. Some traditions call it spirit. So we're not just one thing, we're multiple things at once. So who am I? It's a good question, isn't it? Who am I? Some people say I'm my body. That's who I am. But when I was 16, I had hair and I didn't wear glasses. Now look at me. So I've changed over time. So if I identify with my body, it's constantly changing. If I identify with my opinions, well, our opinions change over time. And Plato says an opinion is a bit of science and a bit of ignorance. So our opinions change. If I say I'm an engineer, I'm a nurse, I'm an accountant, I'm a scientist, well, that's your occupation, that's not who you are. Because if you lose your job tomorrow, who are you? Are you nobody? So it's not so easy. Who am I? The word consciousness I haven't mentioned, so I'll just mention it briefly before I finish. The word consciousness, it comes from Latin, it means to know together. So it suggests that there are many selves inside us. And to become conscious of ourselves is to become conscious of those different selves within us. Our body, emotions, mind, brain, spirit. And it's to start to master oneself. A little bit like a musical instrument. There's different chords happening at the same time, but for them to work in unison to create something beautiful, something noble, something dignified. But consciousness is trying to awaken and to master and perfect ourselves in what we do. So to create oneself. We do martial arts in the school, and one of the first things we're taught is to enter into action, you have to find your center. It's called your hara. You have to find your hara. Because if you don't find your center when you enter into movement, you're imbalanced. You're all over the place, as they say in Dublin. The movement is not, it's a bit awkward. You might hurt yourself or you might hurt someone else because you're not moving in your center. When you spar with your opponent, practice with your opponent, you're trying to go into your opponent's center, to gain their center. So the center is very important to know ourselves. To find a hara is very important to know ourselves, because when we are in our center, then we can coordinate, give perspective, give a direction to all our other selves.